Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 12 about the Georgia Constitution. It's Lesson 9 concerning the Georgia's legislature's power. You will learn about the legislative powers that are granted in the Constitution of the state of Georgia. You'll learn about the legislative powers that are denied, and you'll also learn about the power of impeachment. In these lessons, we're working our way through the Georgia Constitution one article at a time. In this lesson, we'll still be in Article 3 about the legislative branch. The question we're going to address in this lesson is, what powers does the Georgia General Assembly possess under the Georgia Constitution? As we consider that question, let's go back to some basic principles that you've learned in this course. This one goes all the way back to the founding of the United States of America. It's a quote from James Madison that you've seen a couple of times before, where he talks about that powers given to the national government are few and defined, while those given to the states are numerous and indefinite. We get from this the notion that states are given a general grant of power, as opposed to the national government being given specific enumerated powers. Fellow founding father Alexander Hamilton elaborated on this point when he said that when the first formation of government took place, in other words, when the states were created, that every power of the community was given to those state governments, other than the inalienable rights of mankind. Well, this idea of the states having just sort of an overall general power, except for exceptions for the inalienable rights of people, is shown in the Georgia Constitution statement that the General Assembly shall have the power to make all laws which it will deem necessary and proper for the welfare of the state. Notice that that's a general, big, broad grant of power, rather than a specific delegation of enumerated powers like in the United States Constitution. We've called this general broad grant of power in previous lessons the police power, and the state of Georgia certainly has that. The police power gives a state the power to enact whatever laws it may feel are proper to preserve the order and the safety and the security of the people in that state, unless the state government is somehow prohibited from doing so, such as through a Bill of Rights. Yet despite the state constitution granting the state legislature this broad police power, the Constitution goes on to list specific powers that are granted to the General Assembly. Now, this is a little odd, a little mysterious about why they would feel the need to do this, because that overall grant of power allows the legislature to do anything that it's not denied from doing. So there really isn't any reason to then go on and list specific powers for the states. But the Georgia Constitution does that anyway. That's why in a previous lesson we referred to the current Georgia Constitution as a bureaucratic constitution, because it has a lot of incredible specific detail in it, which may be frankly unnecessary. But it does it anyway. And if we can speculate about why this was done by the people who wrote the state constitution, it may have been to kind of guide the state legislature in what they wanted the General Assembly to do. They didn't need to give them these specific powers because they already had them with that general grant of power. But by listing out these specific powers, they were kind of encouraging them to do certain things. So when it talks about these specific powers, it begins with this statement. The Constitution of the state of Georgia says that without limitation of the powers granted, under that general grant of power we already talked about on a previous slide, the General Assembly shall have power to provide by law for, and then it lists a bunch of things. We're just going to look at 3 of those grants of power as examples of them all. The first of those is a passage in the Constitution that says that the state can participate with other organizations, including nonprofits, other municipal and county governments, things like that, for the purpose of encouraging tourism in the state. That may seem like an oddly specific thing to put in the Constitution, but maybe there's a reason for putting it in there, which that reason will show up when we start talking about some powers that are denied to the state. Because when we get to those, you'll see how maybe something like this could potentially conflict with one of those denied powers. And so that might explain why they felt the need to put something like this in as a specific grant of power, so that people later on wouldn't think that the state couldn't do this because of one of these other denials we'll get to in a minute. So that's our first example power of something given to the state to do, promoting tourism along with other groups in the state. A second grant of power to the legislature of the state of Georgia can be seen in this constitutional passage, where the General Assembly is allowed to use public funds to create a pension system for public employees. So now we have two examples of powers granted to the General Assembly to promote tourism and expend funds on pensions. As I said when we talked about the tourism one, these may potentially conflict with something else I'm going to show you in a moment about a power that was denied to the state government. And that may be why these things are included. A third example to show you of these specific powers granted in the state constitution is that the state is allowed to participate in federal programs. And the state legislature can use its power to tax or spend money or condemn property or zone property as it sees fit to work with these federal programs, whatever they may be. So there are three examples of powers that are specifically granted by the state constitution, and there's a whole bunch more actually. Even though the state government was granted a general grant of power, the people who drafted the current state constitution felt the need to put in these additional specific grants of power, including this third one about participating in federal programs. Now, in addition to these powers granted specifically in the Georgia Constitution, the Constitution also denies the General Assembly certain powers. We're going to look at three examples of that. Now, this actually makes a lot more sense. When you generally grant a legislature power, you kind of assume it can do anything that it wants unless you've specifically denied it. So you're going to have a set of denials in the Bill of Rights, where you're protecting individual liberties that people have, but you also may have denials elsewhere in the Constitution, where you just don't want the legislature messing around with certain things, whether they would necessarily infringe upon someone's liberty or not. So this part of the Constitution makes perfectly good sense being there. And I'm going to give you three examples that are found there. The first of those is that it says that the state legislature cannot make local special laws or laws that relate to a specific private person. There's another part that I don't have in this slide where it talks about not making laws for specific populations in the state. So we looked at those together, and they're just prevented from enacting special laws for any sort of group or locality or individual. Now think about some of those things that I talked about just a few moments ago, those specific powers granted to the state, like, for example, encouraging tourism. Arguably, somebody could say, well, you're helping out some specific groups when you do that. And this other part of the Constitution says that you're denied from doing that. Well, they say, yeah, but we've got this other part that says we specifically can't. That may be why some of those specific grants are there, is because of this passage in the Constitution about the state legislature not making special laws for special people or groups. Second example of a power denied to the General Assembly is that it can't create corporations for private people. Now, it goes on to give some other details in that passage of other things that it can't do for corporations. But in general, it says you have to make generally applicable laws. So, for example, if somebody wants to make a corporation, they just have to go through the same procedure as everybody else, rather than getting some sort of specific help from the state legislature. So there's our second example of a power denied. First one, no special laws for any group of people. Second one is no special help for corporations and the individuals creating them. Third example of a power denied to the General Assembly is that they can't give any sort of donations or gratuities. Gratuity is another name for like a tip or a gift or something like that. Or forgive debts to anyone. Essentially, they can't go around giving some sort of presents to people, even former government officials that they may want to reward for a job well done. So now we have these three examples. No special laws, no helping out the corporations, no giving anybody gifts. You take them all together and they seem to have a common theme of what's being denied here. Through the denial of these powers, the Georgia Constitution is preventing the General Assembly from essentially playing favorites. They can't single out one group of people or one community or one corporation or one individual for any sort of special benefits. Now, think back about the founding of Georgia and the whole Yazoo land scandal. Georgia was founded essentially in corruption, and it's been a worry ever since. So there's provisions like this in the Georgia Constitution which are specifically denied to prevent the state government from getting into some sort of corrupt situation like that again. The next power that we want to talk about in this lesson that's given to the state legislature concerns impeachment. Now, you may recall when we've talked about impeachment previously in this course, when we talked about it concerning the President of the United States, impeachment is when you remove somebody from office because they engage in some sort of conduct that is considered bad enough to get them out, such as committing treason or some high crime or some political thing like stuffing a ballot box or whatever it may be. Well, that is provided for in the Georgia Constitution. First of all, it's the Georgia House of Representatives that has the sole power to bring impeachments. Now remember, an impeachment is simply an accusation on the part of the state legislature that this person did something, on the part of the state House of Representatives, that this person did something bad enough that they should be kicked out of office. After the House of Representatives then accuses them of having done something bad enough to be kicked out of office, the Senate holds a trial to decide if they actually should be kicked out. And when they vote at the end of that trial on whether or not to convict the person or remove them from office, according to the state constitution, it must be a 2/3 vote to convict them and remove them. All right, that finishes this lesson. Now let's review what we learned. What is strange about powers granted to the General Assembly in the things that we talked about in this lesson? Is that they are fewer powers than the executives? Is it that the list includes taxing? Is it that the list is incomplete? Or is it that they already have the police power, so why do you even need a list of powers granted? It's that last one. Because the state constitution already grants the General Assembly general grant of power, in other words, the police power, this more detailed list probably isn't really necessary. What is the common goal of denying certain powers to the state legislature in the Constitution? Is it to weaken the legislature? Is it to protect executive power? Is it that you don't want to allow them to play favorites? Or is it to encourage informal dealing within the legislature? It appears that the common goal of denying these certain powers is to not allow the state legislature to play favorites. When it passes laws, they have to be the same for everybody. Who exercises the power of impeachment in the state under the state constitution? Is it the House of Representatives? Is it the Senate? Is it the Supreme Court? Or is it Georgia voters? It's the House of Representatives that exercises the power of impeachment. Now remember, the power of impeachment is merely accusing somebody of having done something bad enough they should be kicked out of office. The Senate is who would then hold the trial, but the impeachment is solely done by the House. And that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 12. It'll be Lesson 10 about Georgia boards and commissions.